Hello and welcome to the Just and Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. As always, I do want to give you all a quick reminder that Just and Center as an organization is supported by donors. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that any gifts that you choose to give to us are tax deductible. We do need your continued support to continue to do the things that we do. We're going to be continuing our series, Makers of the Modern World, as we have been looking at a number of thinkers. We've been looking at Marxist, leftist thinkers, and in the last couple of programs or talks in this series, I spoke about structuralism. So we're moving from the structuralist thinkers then into post-structuralism. So we looked at Saussure, then we moved into Roland Barthes and the development of post-structuralism, and now we move into postmodernity, which many of the major postmodern thinkers are considered post-structuralist thinkers as well. So the first two postmodern thinkers that we're going to be looking at are Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, both of them being French intellectuals who, when you think of postmodernity and just influential French intellectuals, at least post-Sartre, they're probably the two that are going to come to mind the most. So we're going to start with Foucault, and that means the next time we're going to be talking about Derrida. The two of them had a bit of disagreement on a number of issues, but they're both generally categorized as postmodern thinkers. And we're going to see, as we've talked about a lot of these movements, postmodernity is not some kind of clear-cut movement. There aren't a set of particular commitments that we can say every postmodern thinker agrees with, say, these 5 principles. So we're talking about general principles more than anything else. And as we're looking at the modern world and thinking through the intellectuals who have really formed the modern academy, the modern mind, Foucault really stands in some ways head and shoulders above the rest when we're looking at some contemporary issues in the West. And so when we think through, ideologies on a popular level that people describe as woke, I don't tend to like using that term because it's so vague, but usually what people refer to as woke does extend in some way from Foucault. So we're going to see that he has a profound influence on the development of queer theory, gender theory, the way that we talk about race today, and a number of other areas. All right, so we'll start, as we always do, talking a little bit about Foucault's biography. So we'll start talking about his life, how he's raised, and then about his ideas. So, brief biography. He's born in Poitiers in France in 1926. And if you're thinking about intellectuals in France at this time, intellectuals are very well known in France. They're a bit like celebrities. We don't really have the same kind of public intellectuals in the United States. I mean, maybe there are a few figures that may stand out as we consider public intellectuals in the United States, at least, or in the broader English-speaking world. But France, real academics at this time are treated in a way that we don't see in our part of the world, in the English-speaking world. Because even when you're talking about, a public intellectual, usually they're writing books at a more popular level, and a lot of Foucault's work is extremely complex and very academic and not very easy to read, yet his books ended up being bestsellers in France. Doesn't mean they should have been, but they were. So he's born in Poitiers, France in 1926. He is raised in an upper middle class, somewhat wealthy, not ultra wealthy home that was a relatively politically conservative home, and he's going to react against that. Foucault doesn't really speak a lot about his childhood. Even in interviews, when he's asked about things, he makes some negative comments about his relationship with his father. He clearly didn't have a great relationship with his father, but there really isn't enough detail to draw too much out of that. Foucault is certainly an individual who one could analyze psychologically quite a bit to find out why he came to the conclusions that he did. A bit of a psychological or even a Freudian analysis is in some ways hard not to do with Foucault when you start to look at his life a little bit. And so psychologists look at him and start to actually do that in his own lifetime. But we'll try not to psychologize too much. That's certainly not my field, and I don't know him personally. Okay, so his parents were nominally Catholic. They weren't, devoted Catholics, but they were at least culturally, as a lot of people in France were at the time, certainly. But Foucault did get sent at one time to a very strict Jesuit school. And so he did grow up in a relatively conservative politically environment. He was in a religiously conservative environment in school, which seemingly was not great for him. He seems to have reacted pretty significantly against that, but again, we don't have a lot of details there, so I don't want to get too far. He went to the Lycée Henri the Fourth in Paris, and I don't know if that is, I think that's pronounced correct, where he studied philosophy there. So this is one of the best public universities in France. It's a very well-known school, and very academically rigorous. So he shows up. Foucault appears to be very, very intelligent from a relatively young age, and he's always a bit of a loner and an outsider, and you see that in many of the things that he says about his life. While he's studying philosophy, he's largely studying Hegel, so not exclusively, but the individual that he gravitates to in terms of his teaching is an expert on Hegel, and then Foucault's own writing initially is going to be on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. So he writes his thesis on the transcendental in Hegel. And Hegel still has a profound influence upon philosophy all throughout Europe at this time. But he's not only studying Hegel, he also encounters Marx there. We'll talk a little bit about Foucault's relationship to Marxism, which is kind of difficult to pin down. He studies Heidegger, a big influence at the time. Sartre is a very large influence at the time as well, though he's not mentioned here. We're going to do a separate talk on Sartre. Husserl and Kant. So those are the first figures that start to kind of form him philosophically. Eventually, though, his influences are going to shift pretty significantly, especially as he encounters Nietzsche. So Foucault, it's hard to talk about Foucault and his ideas without talking a little bit about his personality and his rather seemingly disturbed life. And, I'm not one to try to, as I've said, psychologize too much. And I'd rather take people's ideas on their own and look at the merit of the ideas as they are, rather than just examining the moral character of somebody's life. And I've tried to do that throughout this series, but to some degree with Foucault, it's hard not to talk about it, because I think the two are so significantly connected, and I don't think it's just incidental the way that Foucault lived with his ideas. I think there's an intimate connection between Foucault's rejection of especially sexual mores, but his rejection of how classical Western ideas of truth and morality are understood, and the way that he lived his life. So I don't think that they're disconnected. All right, so he was known in college for being rather disturbed. He was a bit of an odd guy, as I said. He was a loner, but it was more than just that. He spoke about suicide a lot. His classmates mention that he talked about suicide all the time. He has a fascination with death, a fascination with suicide that shows up throughout his writings, not just suicide, but also various forms of self-harm, which he did inflict on himself at different points. He does have more than one suicide attempt in his life. So he was very clearly depressed, very clearly had some kind of fascination with the dark and depraved and with death. So he had imagery even all over his dorm room of paintings of death and destruction. He surrounded himself with that kind of imagery throughout his life. Similar to probably the kind of people you think of that are fascinated with gore sites and kind of gory horror movies. That he has some kind of weird fascination with this stuff that he writes about, and others just mention it about him that knew him personally. He lived a very promiscuous lifestyle, and that is really hard, I think, to disconnect from his writings, especially because he does write significantly at the end of his life a multi-volume set of works on sexuality and the history of sexuality, where he really challenges some of the basic moral norms of Western sexuality in a Christian context, and then in him arguing for kind of a post-Christian context, which breaks down some of those barriers and analyzes power dynamics, which we're going to be talking about throughout this. So he is a homosexual, which a lot of at the time, some psychologists tried to say was the cause of a lot of his disturbances. So he did see a psychologist because of how disturbed he was as an individual. And I don't know how much of it has to do with this or not. It's not my field. But it's not just that he's living a homosexual lifestyle. He's very promiscuous in that lifestyle. There is some weird stuff about BDSM that I don't really want to get into. And there are accusations, multiple accusations of child abuse in Tunisia, which are consistent with things that he wrote on the issue. So as we are thinking about his work, it is important to see the implications of what he's trying to do in tearing down structures or these power dynamics that have formed, bourgeois, if you want to use that terminology, ideas about sexuality. It is all kind of leading to this. So it does seem that there is a motive that is beyond just the intellectual and what he's trying to do. In some ways, it appears that he is trying to justify his own lifestyle choices. He speaks regularly in his life about just enjoying dangerous things. He's one of these guys that just gets a thrill out of being in danger. Probably know some people like that. And that doesn't always come out in, terrible ways. Sometimes people, go skydiving and climb mountains or whatever. But this can come out in pretty dangerous ways. And he really lives the life of a 1960s radical. He has heavy drug use, hallucinogens, all sorts of other things. He harms his body in many ways. All right. So that's the basic ideas of his biography that I want to go over that are going to be important for looking at the formation of his ideas throughout his life. Now, we've got to talk about his relationship to Marxism. And this is really important because a lot of our dialogue that's currently going on today about Foucault, especially in more conservative circles, which, I am, but people tend to kind of conflate Foucault a lot of times with Marx, or refer to Foucault maybe as a Marxist. At least on a very popular level, people tend to do this. And so I want to say, in light of that, I want to tease out what the relationship is, but I want to say that there are Foucault is not a Marxist in the majority of his life and writings. However, there are very significant parallels between Marx and some of his concerns and Foucault and his concerns. And what we find in a lot of more contemporary left-leaning thinkers, especially the post-Marxists, there tends to be a conflation of some of the ideas, some borrowing from Foucault and borrowing from Marx and putting them together. So I think what you have in a lot of modern leftist academia, and activist circles too, it's not really just academia, because the activists tend to grab onto ideas that are in academia, but don't tend to quite know the roots or how those things function or fit together. So they tend to grab onto kind of contradictory ideas and smush them together. So maybe it's more the activists than anything else, but activists tend to use a Foucaultian approach to power dynamics as the kind of superstructure underlying all social systems. And they combine that with a kind of utopian Marxist approach to history as progress, which is not Foucault's idea. So those two things very much do come together, certainly in leftist activism that we see today. So even if they're not exactly identical in their own thought and ideas, or even if Foucault distances himself from Marx, it's important to understand how they relate, because there's really no doubt that thinkers today and activists today tend to grab onto portions of both of those thinkers and put them together. Okay, so Foucault was at one brief time a socialist. He called himself a socialist during his college years, especially as he encountered a lot of French intellectuals, especially the existentialists were communists. Sartre was a communist. Many others were as well. But he distanced himself from that pretty early on, so he didn't live a long time as an activist. He kind of moved away from that, or being too political in aligning himself particularly with one political ideology. And he considered himself an anarchist, at least at one point. However, he did have pretty strong ties to Marxists. So when he was working at Vincennes, he was a tenured professor. He was able to hire faculty. When he did that, he pretty much exclusively hired Marxist faculty. They were all far left and mostly Marxist. So he had good relations with Marxists throughout his life. He was certainly in leftist circles, which was largely Marxist. So he worked with Marxists, though he himself was not totally committed to that ideology. Now, I think there's a reason why he worked with Marxists so often, or he got along with them so well, even if he was not a Marxist, because there are a lot of common concerns between Foucault and Marx. So we'll talk about similarities, and then we're going to look at what are some of the basic differences here. Now, here's probably the primary similarity between Foucault and Marx is the emphasis on power relations. Now, they're going to do this differently. However, what we see in the 19th century, and this isn't just with Marx because it happens in Nietzsche as well, is that there becomes this obsession with questions of power. And for Marx, this is all explained in economic terms. Nietzsche speaks about the will to power. We'll do another talk on Nietzsche. He speaks about the will to power and the Übermensch, and he sees power as this kind of driving force throughout just human existence and human life. And Foucault grabs onto dynamics of power probably more from Nietzsche than Marx, because he's not speaking so much about, economic inequalities and things like that as later Marxists tend to do. But he does certainly grab onto this dynamic of power. So this is within a lot of intellectual circles in Europe in the 19th century. Power is kind of the talk of the day. And I think that's a major mistake for many reasons. But this is why when you look at movements in the 20th century, whether it's communism or fascism, they are really both heirs to the same fundamentally anti-Christian system that is obsessed with questions of power. And the fascists tend to do it grabbing onto Nietzsche, and the communists do it grabbing onto Marx. But then Foucault is this interesting figure that kind of grabs onto both in different ways. So he's certainly a leftist. I don't think there's any question that Foucault is a leftist, whether he's an explicit Marxist. He is in agreement in terms of, this is the third point here, a rejection of traditional Western ideals. So this is what the kind of common denominator among leftist thinkers throughout the 20th, starting in the 19th, but especially in the 20th century, is a rejection of the classical Western values and classical Western understandings of truth. So even if they're not coming to the same conclusion about what should or inevitably will happen, there is a common enemy in some ways of what is bourgeois Western culture. And Foucault does use that terminology of the bourgeois and is critical of the bourgeois. So I'm not just using that term from Marx to import it into Foucault, but he does use that terminology himself. The next point here, and this is really what I have said is kind of the key point to everything in modern leftist ideology, and I think this is really where we have so profoundly lost our way in the Western world, is that we have rejected the conception of the self as anything transcendent at all. So the notion of the soul is lost, and essentially the self is just a social construct. And then we looked a little bit at Marx and his response to Feuerbach and what he says there about the nature of the self being socially constructed by economics. Now, Foucault's not going to say the same kind of thing exactly. He's not going to say that the self is created by economics, only economics at least. But he is going to say, yes, the self is essentially a social construct constituted largely by power dynamics. On both, there is a rejection of classical liberalism and capitalism. So they're both very, very critical of a lot of ideas of the Enlightenment. And I'm critical of certain ideas of the Enlightenment certainly as well, but it would come from a very different approach. So you can see it's very different from the kind of, Edmund Burke type of response to classical liberalism, because they're really denying any kind of transcendental anything at all, which is especially the transcendent self, which is why they are rejecting a classical liberal perspective. So it's very different from what would be a more classical conservative rejection of certain ideas that you find in the Enlightenment with Kant and a kind of obsessive individualism. So here's the maybe main similarity, this final point here that really ties these two thinkers together, and that is this idea that there is some kind of superstructure that lies underneath the external visible happenings in this world. That it is the role of the philosopher, the academic, to look at the structures of the world and look underneath that, to look at the power dynamics that are at play here. Now, the superstructure for Marx is pretty narrowly going to be about production. Who controls the means of production and who is producing. So the proletariat, the bourgeoisie. Foucault is going to say that we need to find this underlying superstructure that is essentially power dynamics that are at work in basically every social institution and every conversation that we have. And this is where we're going to see huge influences of Foucault on how a lot of conversations happen today. So when people talk, for example, about, say, whiteness or white supremacy, and they're using those terms not just to talk about, say, the institution of chattel slavery, which was race-based, but they're using it to talk about ideologies of what they call whiteness that are oppressive to other minority groups in ways that they're analyzing institutions and saying, well, how is this oppressing this group, or how is this oppressing that group, when it's not obvious, but it's on a broadly ideological scale. So you start to say, and I'm trying to think of, a good example. I could think of a ridiculous one. I just read an article about how white men being attracted to certain parts of women's bodies was actually a form of white supremacy, because that's something that black men do, and white people are trying to appropriate that. So I'm not going to get more in detail about that, but the point is, you can look at anything and try, and if you're committed to seeing some underlying structure, you can find it anywhere. You can find it absolutely anywhere that you look. So like the guy who said, the pastor who prayed Amen and Ah woman, as if Amen has anything to do with males, looking for because you're committed to this, male patriarchal power dynamic, you're going to read it into the fact that the word men shows up in a word that etymologically doesn't derive from anything having to do with men. So those are just some examples of how we do this. So that really is taking what Foucault does in terms of looking for these underlying superstructures to reality. But there are pretty significant differences between Foucault and Marx. So this is the number one difference, is going to be the idea of a teleology. So Marx is coming from a Hegelian perspective, and because of that, he believes that socialism is kind of the natural outcome of the material development of society. So capitalism is one stage that societies are inevitably going to pass through, right? It's an inevitable stage of the development of the world, or the Geist, as Hegel would say, but it's all material for Marx, and that we're moving toward a kind of utopian socialism. There are a lot of utopian ideas at this time as well. They take different forms, not just Marx. But Foucault is not teleologically oriented. He's not a progressive in that sense, that he is not looking for some kind of activist movement that's going to lead to some inevitable progress in the world. So he's not the optimist that someone like Marx is. We talked about this before with a lot of the leftist thinkers following Marx. When the communist revolutions ended up, either not happening or left states in a place of horrific oppression and horrible dictatorships that, just killed, people start to question, while they still grab onto aspects of Marxist thought, they start to question the nature of progress. Is this really inevitable that this is going to happen? Are these socialist revolutions going to happen? So Foucault is not one to say, yes, there's the inevitability of socialist revolution, and here is the kind of programmatic effect of my thought. He's not looking for some unifying meta-narrative that he can contribute to some great end. So he's not teleological in his approach. He's really a figure of destruction in many ways, more than he is of anything actually positive or any goal or hope in the end at all. Another difference philosophically, they're coming from different perspectives in some ways. While Foucault wrote his thesis on Hegel, Foucault really is more influenced by Nietzsche as the major figure in his ideology, whereas Marx is relying largely on Hegel, which results in a little bit of a different approach to power, though Foucault is not exactly identical with Nietzsche. They're very similar in a lot of ways than someone like Marx, who has that underlying kind of teleology underneath that. The third difference, and this is pretty significant, is that though both of them speak a lot about power and oppression, yes, I know exploitation is Marx's term. I know he doesn't use the term oppression. Later Marxists do use the term oppression a lot, and I have Marxists responding to me a lot if I ever use the term oppression in relation to Marx. Marx doesn't say oppression. I know. But exploitation is a form of oppression, and later Marxists use the term oppression. So you get what I'm saying here, okay? The point is they both talk a lot about oppression, but they do it in different ways. So for Marx, it's very strict and clear. There's one bad class and one good class. So there is, the bourgeoisie, and then there's the proletariat. Pretty easy to put that together and say, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. Foucault doesn't do that. So Foucault, in some ways, is more similar to what comes later with intersectionality, that there are these overlapping dynamics of power and oppression that are a lot more complicated, which is why those thinkers are also reject a lot of Marxian power dynamics as well, because they're more Foucaultian. Though a lot of them do still have that kind of teleological orientation, which is a bit more Marxist. But Foucault is more seeing these power dynamics at work just in nearly everything that happens. So he sees it as more all-encompassing than just economic relations. He's basically going to see oppression and power as the root of every single human interaction. Every single thing that we do, every institution that exists can essentially be defined by power. And it's that idea that really stands behind a lot of modern leftist thinkers who look for oppression everywhere. So these are the people that, people joke about on social media as like, is this is racist, or this is the patriarchy. Things that you're like, how did you even make this connection? Because there's just no logical connection between this random thing and oppression. But for Foucault, that's what you should be doing. The historian for Foucault needs, because Foucault is he's a historian largely, and that's what his works are, as we'll talk about some of his works. But he thinks that we should be looking at history and engaging in trying to figure out what the ideologies are, what the discourses, is what he's going to say, are. And ideology is really more of a Marxist term than Foucaultian, but he has other ways of speaking about that. Okay, so there is the basic biography of Foucault. We've talked about how he relates to Marx. And that's important to get out of the way first, just because that forms so many of the conversations that people have today. So in light of that now, we're going to explore some specifics of what Foucault teaches on some of the major themes in his thought. So first we have his idea of power. Now, when Foucault talks about power, he is not just talking about institutional power or state power. He does acknowledge that exists. He refers to this in his work as sovereign power. And this is in contrast to someone like Hobbes. So if you read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, Hobbes speaks largely about power in relationship to the state. So when we're looking at the more classical liberal tradition or post-Enlightenment tradition, pretty much every conversation about power is really about what is the function of the state. And so Foucault is going to say, yeah, those things are true, but that's not really his concern. There's been enough written on that. He's trying to say power is a lot more than just, state versus populace or something. And here's an insight that he grabs from Nietzsche. And this is going to be really thorough going in his work. He talks about this constantly in nearly everything that he writes. And that is that there is this intimate tie and connection between power and knowledge. So power and knowledge are intimately tied together. Nietzsche is the first to really draw upon this, but Foucault moves beyond Nietzsche. But here is where I think Nietzsche's influence upon Foucault is probably most obvious and most significant. Now, he's not going to say that power and knowledge are identical, but they have this kind of reciprocal relationship to one another. So what do we mean by that? Well, when somebody is in a position of power, they will create what they call knowledge. So things that we generally refer to as truth, things that we think are true, are not just taken for granted as truth based on some kind of objective observation of the world. Many of the things, in fact, in some ways, Foucault seems to say all of the things that we accept as true are really formed on the basis of power dynamics. So, for example, because here's one that he uses in his later work on sexuality, is the bourgeois have a certain family structure. And the promotion, this example shows up in a lot of Marxists, and within some a lot of contemporary leftist activist movements as well, that critique the family. And the reason they critique the family is this bourgeois structure that the bourgeois have used to keep themselves in power and make their way of life look normative to everybody else. So by enforcing, say, heteronormative standards of the family, they are really oppressing other people and forcing them to the others to step in line with what the bourgeoisie are doing, so that the bourgeoisie are looked up to as the standard of what is good and right, which in turn keeps them in power. So there's an example of how this kind of thing works. So that knowledge is created by institutions, and Foucault's not just going to say institutions. I'm talking about institutions here, but he's going to say this happens interpersonally as well. So it's broader than institutional. But institutions are probably the most clear place where we see this played out. But it's important to see that Foucault's not just critiquing institutions, because this is every human interaction. But on the other hand, the growth in knowledge also leads one to have more power. So you gain more knowledge so that you can have more power, but then when you have power, you're basically creating or reinforcing what you refer to as knowledge to give yourself more power and to oppress others. So there is this back and forth kind of reciprocal relationship between power and knowledge, that they consistently influence one another. Another part of power that Foucault is going to focus on a lot is what he refers to as biopower. So when he talks about biopower, he's talking about, power over biology. Really, he's talking about the power over bodies. And what Foucault is going to say is that the state controls what you do with your body, because I tell you what's good and bad. They make laws about things. But that power is often coercive, not just in the sense that the state enforces it upon you, but power is coercive in its privileging of certain ideas over others just through social discourse. So educational institutions can, tell you what's okay to do with your body and what's not. So, for example, when I was a kid, we had the DARE programs in school. Now, I don't think they were very effective, and I think studies have shown them to not be very effective. But, you had these, cops come in and talk about, drug abuse and how drug abuse is going to harm your body. Well, even if that's not, yes, there are laws against drug use, but say there weren't any laws and you just had, the educational institution. Well, that is a kind of coercion by telling you what is normal and what is okay. And they're exerting power over you in telling you what you can and cannot do with your body. Think about what you can and cannot do with your body. That sounds a little bit like some responses to certain issues today politically. So he's going to say kind of the ultimate form of oppression is when they control your body, because by controlling your body, they really control your mind or yourself or your soul. But it starts with the oppression of the body. So, I listed some places where this kind of biopower is spoken of by Foucault. He talks about the state. Health organizations do this. Religious organizations do this. Educational institutions do this. Pretty much everybody does. Okay. Think about the CDC, or think about the ads that we had on TV about getting vaccinated, and the things that you see about vaccinations in shows and cartoons that happened as soon as the vaccine for COVID-19 showed up. I'm not making a positive or negative statement about it. I'm just saying that is a form of how these kinds of things work or happen. It's not a statement, negative or positive, so don't get mad at me, YouTube. I'm just using it as an example here. Okay, so disciplinary power. This is then a way of using power or knowledge that is, for Foucault, positive. So even though he's going to be analyzing this power dynamics, and we tend to think you always have to overthrow power, Foucault is going to say, actually, that's not possible. In his view, that's just part of the world. There is power, and these dynamics are at work all the time. We can't really avoid these kinds of power dynamics. We just function on the basis of power in many ways. And so this disciplinary power is talking about power over the self. So he does talk about, we have a sense of power over our own being in some way, and this is actually productive or creative in us. So he's saying that power is not always bad. And here's a kind of positive use of power. He can't say it's all bad because then everything is bad, because everything is power for Foucault. Okay, so here is an important point that I have brought about with Marx and others. And I've basically said that this is a determinative factor, if not the determinative factor, in the loss of a classical understanding of meaning or purpose in a lot of our broader societal issues are the nature of the self. So against classical thought, Foucault is going to say that the subject, the self, is not something that exists objectively as given. So traditionally, the self is defined largely as by the soul. So if you look at classical thought, Christian thought, the self is the soul. The self isn't only the soul, but also a body. But there is a persisting notion of a self that actually exists over time, that is given, that is not just personality traits and the way that we behave. All of that stuff can be influenced externally, but there is something transcendent underneath that is a self that is not created. Well, not created by society, at least. Okay, I would say created by God for sure, but not created by society. So he's going to say that there is no objective subject at all. He's actually going to say that the idea of the self is basically created. It's created with the Renaissance, which is a bit of an odd statement to make, and that's discussed a lot in literature about Foucault. The subject, essentially, though, for Foucault is created in and through society. So we're created through our interactions with others. We're created through these power dynamics that we've talked about. The power dynamics actually make us as people. So I learn who I am in a relationship of power and oppression in some way. Not just learn who I am, but I become who I am. I am only a self in that relationship. So the subjects are both created and oppressed by the society that forms them. So society oppresses us. We are also oppressors in society in various ways, whether we know it or not, because we have to get to the superstructure underneath our actions, because there's always something kind of hidden motive going on under that. But we are created by that oppression and that society, so that the norms of society are, brought or taught to us, even if unconsciously, and they create who we are. So discourse, and Foucault is going to use this language of discourse to talk about the conversation that happens in society that is one of power. So discourse categorizes and subjugates. So he's going to talk about categorization. This is something that society does. We categorize people in various ways, usually to try to make someone the other and to say, well, they're the weird ones. We determine what's normative by categorizing this person and that person and making our category the normal one and your category the weird one. So we're subjugating people by creating categories. We are oppressing them. This is part of our linguistic discourse and in our societal discourse. So discourse is, yes, he's talking linguistically here, but not exclusively linguistically. So you can think back to, if you watched the programs I did on semiotics, you could think about how conversations and dialogues work in terms of societal conversations and structures, or the various signs and how they connect with one another. Okay, so we decide then, or whoever's in power decides what is and what is not normative, and then that is forced on broader society, and then we just kind of imbibe those ideas. So societal rules, or what is normal in society, what we consider to be normal, because there is no real thing as normal, are then accepted as absolute truths. So we just assume, well, of course there are truths. Of course it is true that certain things are bad, that the abuse of young people is bad. Well, who says? You're just saying that because that's what your Western society has said. In ancient Greece, the relationship between adult men and young boys, and this is an example Foucault's going to use, was not that way. So who's to say that you're right and they're not? Perhaps that isn't an absolute law or some absolute moral standard. It's just that society has told you that it is, so you accept that it is. So for Foucault, there is no inner self. And what I mean, he's critiquing two different things here. When he criticizes the idea of an inner self, first of all, he's rejecting the classical sense of a soul, which is that there is some transcendent self that is given by God. But he's also going to reject, in doing this, the existentialist idea. So among the existentialists, there is a search for a kind of inner self, and they would talk about things like creating the self as well, existence precedes essence. And the existentialists, like the postmodernists, are all different from each other, so you got to discuss them differently. But a lot of the existentialist ideas that we find in our culture today are, you have to go off and find yourself. Somebody says, well, I don't know who I am, so I'm going to leave my marriage and go off and explore by doing whatever the heck I want, and then I'm going to find some kind of inner self, my true self. Well, Foucault was going to say there is no such thing as a true self that you can find. I don't totally disagree with him on that criticism, by the way. I think he's right, which is why I'm critical of the existentialists as well. And you have these two basic ideas of the self that you're going to see over and over again within the 20th century that are both rejections of classical thought, but do it in different ways. And the one is that the self doesn't exist at all. It's really just societally determined. So you are determined by societal norms. And the second idea is that there is some kind of inner core essence of who you are that is opposed to the body and the external things, and you have to find it. Both of these movements are against the fundamental Christian idea that we are body and soul. So that we have a true self, but we don't have to be searching in ourselves to find it, because our self is intimately tied to our body and our relations in this world and our vocations and callings and who we are in our family and our society. These things are not separated. And I think some ways this can go back to Descartes, with Descartes' perspective on a mind-body dualism, where there is this radical separation of the inner soul from the external body. And we'll do a program on Descartes as well, on the birth of modern philosophy, but not yet. Okay, next topic that we're going to discuss here, and this is one that is pretty significant in Foucault's writings. He talks about this a lot, and that is sexuality. He begins a series of books on a history of sexuality in 1976, and he dies before it's completed. But in this, he provides a very influential work. So this is cited in the field regularly. All right, so he's going to say that we talk about biopower already, power over bodies. Power over bodies is not exclusively sexual when we're talking about biopower, but it is a place where it becomes very clear. Now, this was very close to Foucault himself because of his homosexuality and because of his other lifestyle decisions, as we may call them. So he's going to say that, like everything else, sexuality is something that is not, there's no objective right or wrong here. There is no objectivity. He's even going to say there's really no objectivity to biology or gender or sexes, which clearly that's going to be highly influential on later thinkers, like someone like Judith Butler. But he's essentially going to say that normative sexuality of, say, monogamous, heterosexual relationships through lifelong marriage, that's not something that's actually inherently good. That's just something that society has that determined is okay. And it's done that because of systems of power, because it has kept these people in power and it's oppressed these people and made categories of people that you can exclude and whatnot. He's going to say, and I mentioned this before, that control of the body is going to lead to the control of the mind. So it starts with the body. And again, it's not just sexuality, that's what we're talking about here, but it shows up in all sorts of ways. And so he reverses the common phrase that the body is the prison of the soul, which shows up in kind of Gnostic writings, those who would say that the body is something bad, that you need to escape the body, like you find in a lot of older Gnostics. He's going to reverse that and say the soul is the prison of the body. So, he's got a clever way of making a lot of these little pithy statements that stick with people, which is probably one of the reasons for his popularity. Okay, so then he says sexuality and gender are not purely biological, but he's going to say they're really social constructs. So the norms that we determine are, there are certain norms for men, there are certain norms for women. All of that is just societally determined. It's, heteronormativity is what term would be used later, that has decided that men are a certain way and that women are a certain way. So these are just social constructs. That very clearly has a strong impact upon how people view gender today, and argue that gender and sexuality are things that, and sex or biological sex can be completely divorced from one another. So power creates an idea of a normal sexuality and then imposes that idea of what is normal upon others. But because of that, because all of this has to do with the body, and everything's oppression really starts with the oppression of the body, or telling you what you can or cannot do with your body, that means that a response to that, which Foucault is going to argue for, so as much as Foucault in some ways isn't an activist in a utopian sense like a Marx, he is going to say that we need to actively resist, or we should actively resist. And the way to resist these power dynamics is by using your body. So the body is an instrument of resistance. So if we want to resist the power dynamics of the oppressive group, the bourgeoisie or whoever, we can do that by using our bodies as an instrument of resistance. And that pretty clearly shows up in just how Foucault chose to live his life, which is why I say that I don't think we can speak about his ideas without also mentioning his own lifestyle choices, because those two things are intimately tied together, and one flows out of the other. And you could debate which flows out of which. Is it the living out of his ideas, or did he create these ideas in order to justify his awful lifestyle? But I guess I can't technically say, so I don't know. But let's see. Okay, he becomes a highly influential figure later in the development of queer theory. So if we talk about someone like Judith Butler, and Butler's going to be a highly significant figure, and we'll talk about her book, Gender Trouble. I'm going to do one of these on Butler, because I have read enough Butler. I've read Gender Trouble, and it's not a fun book to read, but it is a highly influential one. And essentially her argument is Foucault's argument. And she cites Foucault extensively. It's really Foucault brought into conversations of gender. Now, I don't know exactly what Foucault would have done. He died pretty young. He was in his 50s. His lifestyle decisions ultimately led to his death, but he didn't get too explicit about some of these issues, but it's pretty consistent with a lot of where he started to go in a lot of these texts, where people have moved further today. So Foucault is largely a historian. And that doesn't mean he's a very good historian. He's very simplistic in the way that he does his history. He tends to divide up history in very precise, neat categories in order to make his points. So he'll talk about like the classical era, the Christian era, the Renaissance and on, Enlightenment. He kind of has these very rough divisions, and he is going to do a lot of generalizing within those time periods to define things. So he's not always wrong in what he does, but it has been recognized as by a lot of historians who read Foucault as a bit simplistic. So let's talk about the way that he does history, because this really influences a lot of how history is done today and how history is taught in universities. And history is one of those things that, maybe you think of as something objective because you're just talking about what happened. And history may sound like it's objective, and I think when it's at its best, it tries to be objective, at least relatively speaking, but someone like Foucault is going to really radically change the field of history and how it's done, so that history becomes really the history of power dynamics and the history of oppression, because for Foucault, that's the ultimate reality. So if you're going to really study history, what are you going to study but oppression and power dynamics? And certainly that is how a lot of historians do their history today. So, for example, I know that Kristen Dumais, with her very popular book, Jesus and John Wayne, on Twitter at one point, someone had asked her, who her biggest influences were in her method of historiography, and she named Foucault first and foremost. And I don't want to critique the book because I haven't read it, and I don't critique things that I haven't read, but I will say when I saw that, I decided I didn't really feel like I had any desire to read the book, just because I fundamentally disagree with this kind of methodology of studying history. And if that's going to be her way of approaching history, the methodology I disagree with, so I'm not going to agree with the way that she does it. So, again, I'm not going to critique the specifics of the book because I haven't read it, but but it shows that there is this divergence when you're looking at history of how you look at history. Is it a series of objective facts of, this happened, then this happened, or are you trying to get underneath that to explore the power dynamics that are at play? So he speaks about historical method as archaeology. He's got a work called Archaeology of Knowledge from 1969. In this, he rejects what would be either a Christian or a Marxist view of history that is teleological, this view that history is leading toward an end. So for the Christian, this is the eventual coming of the kingdom of God. This is the return of Christ, that God is working out this plan of redemption throughout history, and eventually it will come to this culmination, so that there is actually a sovereign hand at work throughout the historical process. Or within a Marxist view, there is this kind of natural historical development, or in Hegel's view, the development of spirit. Anything that is leading towards some kind of goal or end is rejected. Which is why I say that Foucault's project is really more destructive than anything else. It's not looking for something positive or constructive or some kind of end goal. It's just destruction. Okay, so then we have the displacing of the subject as the center of history. So he's going to say that there is no, subjective, personal, transcendental selves that are the main subject of history, the main topic of history. Certainly he's not going to see a transcendent God as being involved in history, as would be, my approach as a Christian theologian, certainly. But instead, he's going to say that the historical study is really the study of discourse. And remember, discourse is about these power dynamics as they play out in society, both linguistically and just through institutions or rules that are generally understood. We might talk about them as like kind of the signs, like we talked about in semiology. So he speaks about historical periods as episteme is the term that he uses, which is, he says that there are these different, this is similar to how Marx uses the term ideology, or other Marxists use ideology, but essentially that there are these, and you can see a little bit of Hegel here, but there are these different eras where in these different eras, different periods of time, there are unique views of truth, unique views of humanity, unique views of morality, reality itself. And so we can look at each of these kind of epochs of history and say, well, what ideology was active during that time? Or what ideology was active during that time? And the assumption underneath this is there is no objective truth. There's just the historical study of what people believed then and what people believe now. And essentially, this history is really a history of power and oppression. All right, so he also speaks about historical method as a genealogy, which this comes from Nietzsche. It's not exactly the same as what Nietzsche does here, but there certainly are strong parallels between Foucault and Nietzsche. And so this genealogical study, it's a study of history without reference to the transcendental. So there is no transcendent God, there is no transcendental self, there is no transcendent truth, goodness, beauty, anything like that in the study of history. It is simply the study of different historical epochs or time periods where the discourses tend to change, and that forms the various power dynamics of each time period. And so that's what he does throughout his books. All right, so then the final thing on historical method here is the deconstruction of truth. And I think this really is a destructive or deconstructive project more than it is a constructive one in any way. I think you see this in Foucault's very disturbed psychology, and this shows up in his quite disturbed historical study as well, that he loves death and destruction. I mean, he admits this. He loves death, destruction, and suicide, and he views history as really the history of death and destruction, and his whole historical project is destruction. So the deconstruction of truth as simply development of ideas and power in different historical periods. So we're deconstructing truth. We're saying that truth is not something objective, it's not something transcendent. There simply are ideas that people have, and there are power dynamics, and there is oppression. And that's what reality is. That's it. Kind of a very, very bleak view on life that we find in Foucault, which I think was apparent in view on life and how he viewed himself and the value of life and the value of other people. Okay, so then he has these studies of history that he engages in throughout his life. And these really are, and we've talked about mostly the underlying ideas behind what Foucault does, and those underlying ideas show up in all of these works. So what his historical works do are he's really applying those basic ideas that I outlined here to different subjects. So if you read his actual works, you can start to see, if you understand those basic ideas, you can start to see how he applies them with different topics. So in 1961, he has The History of Madness. And here he talks about how society has viewed people who are mad or who are crazy. And, in his view, this has changed radically in history. So it was only recently that people, created insane asylums and started putting the mad away. And in the past, perhaps the mad were viewed as kind of prophets or people who viewed reality in a different way or had some kind of insight that other people didn't have, where they were just odd. But then society gradually started to make this clearer distinction between those who are sane and those who are insane. And in order to promote the kind of normativity of being sane, we have decided to, put the insane in asylums. And so I think that relates today to a lot of the talk about normalizing nearly everything. That everything needs to be normalized and that stigma is bad, so you need to destigmatize whatever. And that really comes from Foucault, because from Foucault, there are social stigmas put on certain groups of people or certain behaviors that are done for the sake of, those who are in power having and keeping that power and making others weird or odd, or they're not standard. They don't fit in with whatever society says that they should do. So we need to destigmatize or normalize all behaviors, except for ordinary behaviors. Okay, so then we have another study, The Birth of the Clinic, an archaeology of medical perception, where he talks about how people view medicine and hospitals. And in that work, he's going to make a similar argument that people are basically locked up. And here's where, when you see madness and the way people are put in asylums, you can kind of get the argument. But then here you see it in a much more absurd way, which is people do that in hospitals too. They lock people up in hospitals because they want to keep them separate from the world because they're abnormal, because of their medical issues or something. So it works in the same way as an asylum. So you're looking at hospitals. Hospitals can't just exist to help people feel better. They can't just be a place where people need to come and their bodies get fixed. Instead, hospitals are a means of oppression, of making someone the other so that we can oppress or harm them. Then we have The Order of Things, an archaeology of human sciences. He's going to make a very strong argument that there isn't really an objective study of science or scientific facts. Science itself is really, and the disciplines of science are just a means of oppression and power. You see this in some talk today about certain fields of science or mathematics as being, racist in some way or another, or colonialist, so that the purpose of, say, math class should be talking about power dynamics of how math has been used to oppress this and that group, instead of just teaching people the objective facts of reality, because there are no objective mathematical facts in reality. There's just power and oppression. That's Foucault's view, and that shows up pretty significantly today. Then we have Discipline and Punish, which is the one that's probably cited the most. I mean, this is the one that when I read works on Foucault, this tends to show up maybe more than anything else, which is how society views discipline and how it's changed its approach to discipline. In the past, we looked at retributive justice and things like that, but now we have an idea of restorative justice. We again lock people up in jails because we want to otherize them by showing power over them, that they're abnormal, so they're in prison. And then he has his work on the history of sexuality, which we already discussed a bit. That is a pretty significant area for Foucault in his own life, and certainly the area where all of this has the most impact beyond Foucault's own life and writings. All right, so I really didn't think I was going to be able to keep this in an hour, and somehow I did. I don't know how I did that with Foucault. There's a lot to talk about. I'm sure I probably missed lots of things, but I paced myself pretty well somehow. I'm surprising myself here. So there is the basic ideas in Foucault. Foucault is a very complex figure. He's written a lot of books. He's been written about quite a bit. So there is always much more to say about Foucault. But I think in this study, hopefully you have been able to see how Foucault is really one of the most significant figures for our modern world, and how the way that we talk about history, the way that we talk about ideas, the way that our education systems work have been fundamentally altered by Michel Foucault in a variety of ways. So in the next program, then, in this series, we are going to be looking at Jacques Derrida, who is the other most significant French intellectual at the same time, who was a peer of Foucault, and they disagreed on a number of things, but there are plenty of commonalities. So if you want to understand the two most significant postmodern thinkers, you want to know Foucault and Derrida, and we'll get to that next time. So anyway, thank you so much for watching the program. I hope you enjoyed this. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe on YouTube and also subscribe on your podcast app, and you can just get the audio. You can listen in your car if you don't feel like sitting in front of your computer screen and looking at my face. So we'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much. God bless.